A few years ago, an unusual article appeared in the magazine Chess, suggesting an entirely new line in the king pawn openings. Now these openings have been played for centuries, played out even, and discovering a new variation is almost like finding a new way to tie a knot. This cassette is devoted to researching the variation, to discover whether it really is a new weapon, or just basically harmless. The opening is called Taylor's variation, after its inventor, John Taylor of Leicester. The opening begins 1 e4, black pawn to e5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, and now white plays bishop to e2. It's easy to see why this move has been ignored up till now. When the open games, which began with e4, e5, were popular, aggressive piece positioning was the order of the day, so the bishop would go to c4 or b5. Later, the hypermodern theorists spawned a whole load of laid-back variations involving bishop fianchettos, bishops at g2 and g7. And we got things like the King's Indian, Benoni, Piet's, Modern, Reti, and English openings. But bishop e2 seems neither one thing or the other, neither an aggressive nor a hypermodern move. Let's see what advantages the move has. It clears the back row for castling, develops the bishop, yet does not expose it to enemy attack. In so many of the lines of the Gyoko piano, the bishop at c4 is used as a target for black's freeing thrust, d7 to d5. On the minus side, the bishop blocks the e-file, which may sometimes be useful for a rook to play down. The move 3 bishop e2 leads in many cases to variations similar to the Ponziani opening, which begins with 3 pawn to c3. However, there is one critical difference. After 3 pawn to c3, one of the recommended moves is black pawn to d5. Now, if white were to play e4 takes d5, black could recapture with his queen, without fearing an attack from an enemy knight coming to c3. This, however, is not the case when white plays his bishop to e2 on move 3 instead of his pawn to c3. In that case, after d5, e takes d5, black queen takes d5, white can immediately gain a tempo on the black queen with knight to c3. So, here's one possible advantage of the bishop e2 move, that it avoids a very strong counter, which is very popular against the Ponziani. Now, a second advantage of the move 3 bishop e2 occurs if black plays the very natural bishop to c5 on move 3. This is from diagram 1. Then white can usefully play the fork trick. Knight takes e5, black recaptures, knight takes e5, and now white pawns from d2 to d4. Now this will regain the white piece and give him a superior position in the center, because he will have one pawn on e4 to black's no pawns anywhere, except on d7. Now this wouldn't have been possible, this fork trick, if a white bishop had been on c4, because in that case the black knight at e5 would then been able to capture the white bishop at c4 after white made the forking move, pawn to d4. Now let's return again to our diagram 1. Now the main challenge to the system comes with the move 3 black knight to f6. This makes a direct attack on the white e-pawn, and if white stoops to defend it, he'll lose the initiative. Thus, if white were to play 3 knight c3, black could answer bishop f8 to b4. And three pawn to d3 is not very inspiring. It's hardly going to give white a central superiority. Won't give him an inferiority, but no initiative. Now, in order to whip up early initiative for white, we're going to look carefully at the move d2 to d4 on move 4. This is after black's knight f6. This aims for central superiority, and in some lines it does offer a pawn sacrifice. Now black has a quiet choice here at his disposal. He can avoid all theoretical disputes by playing his pawn from d7 to d6. Now in this case, white would be able to play his knight from b1 to c3, defending the e pawn, and he no longer fears the move bishop f8 to b4. Now this position must clearly be better for white, but in offhand games I found that there have been problems for white in the placing of his knight at c3, where it blocks the c pawn at c2, because if white ever pushes pawn to d5, his later follow-up is liable to be c4 and c5 to try and open a file on the queen's side to enable him to break through with his rooks. But with the knight at c3, this maneuver is not going to happen. Now there's possibly two ways around this, or there's three. We'll look at some of them. Now after black plays d6, white knight c3, black bishop e7, we can try for f2 f4 by white instead of c2 c4. We can look at that. White castles king's side, black castles king's side. Now white could play d5, black knight to b8, white knight from f3 to d2, following his plan, black knight from b8 to d7. Now white plays pawn to f4, black e takes f4, and white knight from d2 to c4. If possible, white would like to recapture with his bishop rather than his rook. The weaker pieces we would rather put in the center first. Now if black plays pawn to g5 here to hold his pawn, white could start an interesting attack with pawn to g3. Black could play pawn takes g3, white bishop takes g5, and now if black plays pawn takes h2 check, white could try king to h1. This would be an interesting sort of gambit, which could be quite good for white, because he's always got this possibility of bringing his queen up to d4, and that diagonal could be very uncomfortable for the black king. Now black could, instead of playing g7 to g5, play his knight to c5. In that case, maybe white would just recapture with his rook. Rook takes f4, which regains his pawn and defends the white pawn at e4. Now let's go back to diagram 2. This is after black's played his d6. Now, and this time we won't bring our knight to c3. We could play pawn to c3. And this actually doesn't lose a pawn, because if black plays knight takes e4, white could push on pawn to d5, and after the black knight moves away at c6, white has got a fork, queen to a4 check, winning the knight at e4. So we won't play knight takes e4 for black. We'll just continue our development. Bishop e7, white castles, black castles. Now the pawn is threatened at e4. White could defend it by knight d2, knight b1 to d2, or he could play pawn to d5, black knight to b8, and now queen to c2. And then white will later be able to advance c3 to c4, and eventually c4 to c5. This looks tortuous, but it does give white a certain plan for the middle game. Now, the third possibility from diagram 2 is for white just to maintain the tension. So after black plays d7, d6, knight c3, black bishop e7, white castles, and black castles. Now here white could play pawn to h3, and this would safeguard him, enable him to play a later bishop e3 without having his bishop attacked by the black knight coming to g4. White could then carry on with queen to d2, and he would have a good central position, bring his other rook to the d file, and if he were able then later to advance f2, f4, if he could engineer his knight from f3 out of the way. Well, having discussed pawn to d6, we'll look at black's more aggressive lines. Note that here, after white plays his move pawn to d4, black doesn't really benefit by playing knight from f6 takes on e4. White can regain the pawn immediately by playing d takes e5, or perhaps better might be pawn to d5. Knight to e7, white knight takes on e5, and white has a strong pawn at d5, cramping the black game. Now we're going to go straight into the main line, and from diagram 1, black plays knight f6, white pawn to d4, and we're going to look at black's e5 takes d4. White now plays his pawn from e4 to e5, which kicks away the knight at f6. This knight has got three possible squares. It can go to d5, e4, or g4. We're going to look at the most obviously dangerous, which is knight from f6 to g4. It becomes apparent that white has great difficulties defending the e-pawn, as bishop f4 is met by d7 to d6, which liquidates the white pawn at e5 and leaves white with absolutely nothing at all. However, we now come to one of the corner ideas of the system. Instead of defending his e-pawn, white just castles and leaves it in the lurch. He's aiming to get compensation along the open e-file against black's king. Let's see how this one works out. Black plays knight from g4 takes e5, white knight f3 takes e5, and black knight c6 takes on e5. White now plays queen d1 takes d4. White is a pawn down, but black is 2 moves away from castling, and his knight is attacked. So time is very important here. One obvious reply for black is to play d7 to d6. However, after white knight to c3, black has difficulty in continuing his development. He might try bishop to e7, but this would be met by white pawn to f4, and when the black knight moves away, white can capture the undefended pawn at g7. This theme, the capture of the pawn at g7, runs through many of the variations, and the loss of the g-pawn is not so dangerous in itself. It's more significant in depriving the black king of any possible shelter on the king's side. Now let's return to diagram 3, and black's knight at e5 is under attack from the queen at d4. Another possible move, which appears to gain time, is to play knight e5 to c6, retreating and attacking the white queen at the same time. Now let's see, where do you think the queen should go? White should move his queen from d4 to c3. This keeps the attack on the g7 pawn, and thus prevents the movement of the bishop at f8. Now if black does nothing at all, white will continue with rook to e1, blasting the black king off the board. So black could try here d7 to d5. Here he's planning to block the e-file with black bishop to e6. Now white plays bishop from e2 to b5 with a threat of capturing the knight on c6. If black now breaks the pin with bishop to d7, white answers bishop takes c6. He wants to play this move now, because otherwise black may extricate himself by playing knight e7. So white plays bishop takes c6, and black hasn't got a good recapture. If he takes with the bishop, then white would play rook e1 check, and black's king would have to move, or he'd have to lose his g7 pawn after bishop e7. On the other hand, if black plays b7 takes c6, the check still comes on e1, and if black plays bishop e6, white will just play queen takes c6 check. And black is in several degrees of discomfort. After queen takes c6 check, black couldn't interpose with the queen, he'd lose his rook on e8. He couldn't even put his king on e7, because immediate destruction after bishop g5 check, f7 to f6, and now queen c6 takes e6 checkmate. Triumph on the central e-file. Now let's return again to diagram 3 and play again knight to c6, and white plays queen c3. Now black could cut the knot by playing queen d8 to f6. Just exchange the queens and we're a pawn up, we hope here. So white will exchange, he has to, queen takes f6, black g takes f6. I said actually white had to. I suppose he could have played rook e1, but no, I think queen takes f6, g takes f6, and now white knight b1 to c3. Now besides the doubling of the kingside pawns, white has got other advantages, and the main one is that his knight's threatening to come into d5, attacking the pawn at f6 and the one at c7, and possibly there isn't a really good defense to that except king from e8 to d8, which has got quite a lot to be said for it because it gets the king off that open file. Now white plays knight d5, black bishop to g7. That seems to guard everything. How would you now continue for white? Just turn off and decide on your move. Well, the obvious move here is bishop to f4, but I'm not sure if it's the best because black could answer with knight e5. Maybe white, instead of bishop f4, could play bishop to d2. This is a bit more subtle. It threatens bishop to c3, attacking the pawn at f6. And if black plays something like knight e5, then white would be ready to play pawn from f2 to f4. And he would drive that knight away and then be able to capture at f6. Now, after bishop to d2, as I said, if black played, say, d7 to d6, white would play bishop c3, knight e5, and then f4. But instead of d6, black could try pawn to f5. That stops bishop c3, but then it lets in white in the other direction. White can now play bishop g5 check, which is very damaging to black. Right, well, this whole variation doesn't look very encouraging for black. So we'll return now to diagram 4, where black has just played knight f6 to g4, and white has castled. Now, instead of rashly taking the pawn, there are two alternatives that look promising. They are d6 and bishop e7. Now we'll look at d6 first. I used to think this move destroyed the variation, but having looked up Taylor's analysis in chess, I'm not quite so sure. White's e5 pawn is under fire. It doesn't do him any good to play e takes d6, as after bishop takes d6, black is ready to castle. Taylor suggests that after d6, white should play knight f3 takes d4, and he gives a line black knight g4 takes e5, white pawn to f4, black knight g6, white knight takes c6, black pawn takes c6, white queen to d4, concluding with the comment, black has no satisfactory continuation. Well, this is an imaginative variation which exploits black's difficulties in getting his king into safety. We should note that white has also a nasty fork by queen e4 check on hand. Because of this, black can't play queen f6 or even c6, c5. Now if we return to diagram 4, there's another interesting variation black could play, and that is d6, white knight takes d4, and now black d6 takes e5. White must then play knight takes c6, black queen takes d1, white rook takes d1, black b7 takes c6, white bishop to f3. Now black's b7 pawns, c6 pawns under attack, and black must play bishop to d7. If he plays bishop b7, his knight on g4 will go. Now how would you continue for white here? Turn off the tape and decide your move. Well, white can finish black off with rook takes d7, black king takes d7, white bishop takes g4 check. This gives white 2 pieces against the rook and the pawn, which should be a substantial advantage. So Taylor lives again. This variation, d6 takes e5, doesn't solve black's problems. Now let's go back to diagram 4 again, and I'd like to consider black's main continuation after white has castled. This is to play bishop f8 to e7. Now black plans to capture the pawn at e5, but his intention is to first prepare his king's safety. White's most promising continuation is to go straight ahead with the pawn sacrifice. He plays knight f3 takes d4, black knight g4 takes e5, white f2 to f4, black knight g6, white f5, black knight takes d4, white queen takes d4, black bishop to f6. The white queen goes back to f2, and now black plays knight e7. He could play knight e5, but putting the knight on e7 enables him to attack the front f5 pawn. Now let's consider what compensation white has for this pawn. Black is clearly going to castle kingside, and then white will be able to move up his pawns from g4 and hopefully to g5, and then he'll be able to break into black's king position. Now let's see how a game might continue. White plays here knight b1 to c3, Black d7 to d5, threatening the advanced f5 pawn. White plays g2 to g4, and black castles. Now at this point white can't push on to g5 because black would take at c3 and then capture at f5, and white's attack would really be crippled. White's got to keep his advanced pawn at f5, which is really cramping black's development quite badly. So first white plays bishop e2 to d3, and now there is a threat of g4, g5. Black can defend against this by moving his knight from e7 to c6, and white's natural retort is then queen to g2. This meets the threat, and meets the threat of bishop d4, which would exchange some pieces, and it also produces a threat against the d5 square, and it threatens the pawn to g5 move. A game against the Novak 3.6 MHz constellation continued. Black knight to b4, white pawn to g5. Black now played bishop takes c3, white pawn takes c3, black knight takes at d3, and white pawn takes at d3. Here, as the threat of f6 is very strong, black played f6 himself, and white chose to play pawn to g6. And I think here black should have played pawn h6, even though white would have a nice bind on the king side, and could then pay attention to the center and the queen side to break through. Anyway, black played h7 takes g6, white f5 takes g6. Black here went d5 to d4, white c3 to c4. Black moved his queen to d6, and white played bishop f4. Black here surprisingly gave back his pawn at c7 in order to exchange the queens. Presumably he felt there was an attack coming by white, which of course there was, maybe queen g3 to h4 followed by queen to h7. But it's unusual for a computer to show such foresight. So black played queen e6, white moved his rook from a1 to e1, black went queen g4, and white played bishop takes c7. Here black may do best to exchange queens, play his bishop to g4 and then h5 to capture that dangerous g6 pawn. But white would still be better because he could move his rook up to f4 and then take on d4 and have a dominating position despite the opposite colored bishops. Instead black played b7, b6, white went rook e7, black queen takes g2 check, white king takes g2. And after black's bishop b7 check, white played king g3 with much the better position. Possibly black will be able to get the rooks off. Rook e8, white rook e1, rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Now black would need to play bishop c6 to try and exchange the rooks. I expect white could play then bishop to bishop to f4. And black's game's very difficult. Now, this game, and there are a couple of others in the analysis of Taylor's variation in my own article for Popular Chess, which is enclosed in the material with the cassette. These materials should help you if black plays the knight g4 variation. And now we want to go back to diagram 4, and we'll look now at black's other move. Now, so instead of black having his knight on g4, we'll put the knight on d5. That's in diagram 4. Now this move, black knight from f6 to d5, doesn't look very good for me, because the knight will eventually come under attack from the queen at d1. There are always possibilities like that. For example, white can play c3 sometimes, and black couldn't take on c3 with his pawn because his d5 knight is hanging. And black can't afford to lose time, as he will, by having his knight in an exposed position. Now let's see, after knight d5, I consider white should castle kingside. That looks the best. And now if black plays bishop to c5, then white pawn to c3 is much too strong, because black in fact won't be able to maintain his pawn at d4, so there's no point in playing bishop c5, which would just get the bishop attacked. Now, instead of bishop c5, black ought to play his safer move, bishop e7. Bishop c5 is okay in the Gyoko piano when the bishop has got a fairly secure post, but it doesn't work usually in Taylor's variation. So bishop e7, and white plays knight f3 takes d4. Now here we see that black cannot play knight c6 takes e5 because of white's move knight d4 to f5, and this discovers an attack on the knight at d5 and hits the important g7 pawn. This variation alone is good evidence of the weakness of the knight d5 move. Now let's put the white knight back at d4 and the black knight at c6 and the white pawn at e5. Now maybe if black plays knight takes d4, queen takes d4, knight b6. Well, this is possible as well, but doesn't look very inviting. White could play queen g4, black castles, and bishop h6 wins the exchange. So actually after queen g4, maybe black should play pawn to g6. Even then, maybe bishop h6, d6, discovering an attack on the queen, queen g3. What does black do? Pawn takes e5, queen takes e5. Looks a thoroughly miserable game for black. So let's leave the knight d5 variation, quickly dispensed with, and now look at black's other promising move, which is to move his knight from f6 to e4. So that's diagram 4 with the knight on e4 instead of g4. Now here's, with this move, black intends to play a more central game than he has with the other variations, and he's not so much trying to gain white's pawn at e5 as to establish a good outpost for his knight at e4, which will be pretty useful because it will prevent white utilizing the e-file. Now after knight e4, white again castles, and now black is quite likely to play bishop f8 to c5. This move, as I say, isn't a very good one, but it is one that a lot of your opponents are liable to choose. Now, a game between M. Basman and R. Moore in a simultaneous exhibition, Weybridge 1984, continued white pawn to c3, black pawn took on c3, and now white went queen d1 to d5, plummeting right into the middle of the position and hitting the knight at e4, and if that moves, of course, the bishop at c5 would go. So black had to start already giving back pieces. He first played pawn takes b2, white played bishop takes b2, black went bishop takes f2 check. White could have here played rook takes f2, followed by king takes f2 with good position, but he chooses instead king to h1, which more or less forces the win of a piece. Black had to play knight g3 check, white pawn takes g3, black bishop takes g3, white b1 to d2. And though black has got several pawns for the piece, general state of his game is virtually resignable. Now if we return to diagram 4 again and put the g4 knight on e4, We could consider black playing d7 to d6, but in that case I believe white bishop to b5 is a strong answer, as black hasn't got sufficient control of the attack on the e5 square. If black plays d takes e5, white would play knight takes e5, and he's threatening the black knight at c6. Now black could play queen d8 to d5 here. Well, maybe this move's slightly awkward, so instead of taking on e5, knight takes e5, let's say white plays rook f1 to e1, and now if queen d5, white could go c2 to c4, and black couldn't play pawn takes pawn because his queen would lose, and if he moved his queen to c5, white would play rook takes e4. So, as I say, d6 doesn't look right for black. Now back to diagram 4. Now we'll have black's knight at e4, and we'll play d7 to d5 for black. Now the d7 d5 move is the most solid of all black's moves, and of course white here has the opportunity to play knight f3 takes d4. And this intends to follow up with f3, ejecting the knight at e5, and later bishop e3, f4 and f5, exploiting the kingside pawn roller. However, the $64,000 question here is, can black capture at e5 by knight c6 takes e5? We'll examine the position carefully. Taylor's suggestion is f3, black knight f6, bishop b5 check, c6, white rook to e1, black plays c takes b5, white rook takes e5 check, and black plays bishop e7, white queen to e2. The whole point of this series of moves is to prevent black castling kingside, and white succeeds in doing this. Black will probably play a7, a6, white knight to c3. It looks like white's doing quite well here. Black may have to play king f8 and possibly bishop g5, and if white can get in rook to e1, there'll be a lot of pressure down that e-file against the black position. However, there's a more awkward variation black could play, and this is from diagram 5. If white plays knight takes d4, black knight takes e5, and now white pawn to f3. Now what if black plays knight to d6? The line Taylor here gives is white pawn to f4, black knight c6, white knight c3, and he says white has pressure here. However, after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, pawn to c6, I don't actually see much compensation for white. Black threatens queen b6 or knight f5, repelling the borders. Now this could be quite a serious dent in the Taylor variation if black's play is correct here. So we'll return to diagram 5 again and play white knight takes d4, black knight c6 takes e5. Now there are some alternatives white could choose here. He could try pawn to f3 again, and after knight d6, instead of playing pawn f4, which allows knight c6, white could play knight to c3 straight away. If black now defends with pawn to c6, now white could play pawn to f4. Now at this point knight g6 doesn't look very good because white advances pawn to f5 and possibly pawn f6. So instead black retreats his knight to d7. White can play pawn f5, black bishop e7, white king h1, black castles, and now white pawn to g4. And here white's got similar pressure to that which he attained in the knight g4 variation. In this position, though, black's defensive chances seem rather better than in the other line. Now let's return to this diagram 5 again and play white knight takes d4, black knight takes e5. We could choose another line for white. This is, instead of pawn to f3, we can play bishop e2 to b5 check. And this is before black's got the chance to retreat knight d6. There's a game, Basman against Conchess, which went here bishop d7. I don't think that's the best. Pawn f3. Bishop takes b5 by black. Knight takes b5 by white. Bishop c5 check. Now king h1. Now in this position it looks like black can win with knight f2 check. Rook takes f2, bishop takes f2. But in fact he would then run into a fork when white plays queen to e2. So Conchess's move was to play not knight f2 check, he played pawn to c6. White played f takes e4, black c takes b5. Now white played aggressively, queen to h5, black queen e7, white knight c3, black d takes e4, white bishop g5, black queen to e6, white knight to e4. And white had good play for this for the position. Good position for white. Now if we go back to diagram 6 and we look again at this move after knight takes d4, black knight takes e5, bishop b5 check. Clearly the best move for black is c6. White plays bishop to f4. He could go f3, but I feel this weakens the king side a bit. So let's try bishop f4. Now, if black, say, moves his knight back to g6, there are possible sacrifices on c6 by white, because followed by bishop takes pawn check and things like queen takes d5. So maybe black plays bishop d6 instead. White could now continue bluntly with bishop takes e5, black bishop takes e5, then knight takes c6, black pawn takes c6, white bishop takes c6 check. But at the end of it all, black captures white's pawn at b2, and in fact he ends up with the better position. So an idea for white, instead of bishop takes e5, is to play knight takes c6. And this looks a bit of a confusing move, but it's not that different. Supposing black plays knight or pawn takes c6, white would then play queen takes d5 in either case. And what is happening is that black's pieces in the center of the board are rather vulnerable, so in any series of captures white will probably get as many of black pieces as white has lost. So let's say black plays after knight takes c6, he plays pawn takes c6, so white plays queen takes d5. Now black could play, well, he could possibly play castles. So white plays queen takes e4, and he'll answer pawn takes b5 by queen takes a8. So there are possibilities here. Say black plays rook e8, white could probably just play rook knight c3 here, not fearing any discoveries from the black knight. Say if black goes knight g6, white would play queen takes c6, and he's hitting a couple of black rooks. So as I say, the complications aren't necessarily in black's favor. Taylor's variation, side 2. Now let's look at an actual tournament game involving the Taylor's variation. This occurred in round 2 of the British Championship. White was myself, Michael Basman. trying the line against Mark Hebden, who is a fairly strong international master. White played e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, black knight to f6, and white pawn d2 to d4. Black captured e5, takes d4. White e4 to e5, and here black chose his knight from f6 to e4. Now white castled, and black played d7 to d5. This was all as he had played in his game from a few years back against the author of the line, Taylor. And in that game, Taylor played knight takes d4, and Hebden replied with knight takes d4. Didn't capture the pawn at e5. Now I wasn't sure that in this game Hebden might not notice the pawn at e5 and capture that. And I was rather worried about losing it. Didn't see quite the counterplay, though on the last side I did suggest some ways of obtaining counterplay. So instead I played bishop, instead of capturing knight f3 takes d4, played bishop c1 to f4, intending to capture next move with the knight. So this is probably a serious alternative to capturing on d4, and this game will probably give us some idea of how viable it is. Now, a natural move for black after white plays bishop from c1 to f4 is to play bishop from f8 to c5. This would be to sort of reinforce his pawn at d4. After that I'd intended bringing my knight from b1 to d2, and which threatens to go from knight d2 to b3, and then after black goes back to b6, white will play knight takes d4, regaining his pawn. Now after knight to d2, black could play knight from e4 takes d2, white would play queen takes d2. Now black could castle, white pawn to a3, black pawn to a5, because white's threatening b4 and then b5, and now bishop to d3 for white, leaving the black pawn at d4 as a dead point and pointing his pieces in the direction of the black king. And this looks promising sort of position for white. I mean, if black plays something like h6 here, I would be rather tempted to take the pawn and mate black. So let's return those pieces. Go back to diagram 5 with the black knight now at e4. Now after white's bishop f4, Hebden chose a different move to bishop c5, rather an interesting one. He played g7 to g5, probably expressly to annoy me, because I myself used that move rather earlier on in the game. So g7, g5, and now I really have to retreat my bishop. The only good square is c1. Any other square, well, g3 doesn't look good after h5, so bishop back to c1. And here we have an interesting choice for black, and he could play the move g5 to g4, which at the time I spent some time considering what I would do if black chose that move. Now we can say that white would take on d4, knight takes d4, and black would play knight c6 takes e5. Now again, I'd like you to turn off the tape and decide how you would play as white in this position. Now in this position, certainly possible to play bishop f4, and if black goes bishop g7, white could try his bishop b5 check maneuver, followed by
capturing at e5 and then maybe sacrificing at c6. That line is worth considering. I have some doubts about it. Now, the other line, the one I'd like to suggest, is white playing knight b1 to c3 to challenge the black knight at e5. White really wants to open the game and attack the king, especially as black has advanced his g-pawn down. Now, if black captures on c3 and then plays, say, bishop g7, white would play his bishop out to a3 and prevent black castling. So black... Now, after this knight takes c3, b takes c3, black could also go bishop d6, and that stops bishop a3, but maybe if white now opens with f2, f4, g takes f3, bishop takes f3, that hits d5, c6, now bishop to h5, black castles, bishop h6, black rook e8, knight f3, white has, well, he's got a good looking attack against the weakened black position. Now let's go back to diagram 7, and white plays his knight c3 move. Maybe black doesn't take, why should he? Plays bishop g7 himself. White now answers with f2 to f3, opening up the game. Black plays g takes f3, white knight takes f3. Now, a test game I played against Constellation 3.6 megahertz went black knight takes f3, white bishop takes f3, and now black took on c3. White took back with the pawn. Here black defended his pawn at d5 with bishop e6. White played rook b1. Doesn't mind too much about his c3 pawn going because the weak black pawn structure. Now black played some strange moves at this point. I think he should have castled kingside and hoped to defend on that side. Instead he played queen d6. White took on b7, and now walking right into the lion's den, castles queenside by black. So white just retreated his rook, rook to b3. Now black should have done his best to consolidate his position a bit, but went off after a few pawns. Queen c5 check, king h1, bishop takes c3. Well, this is much too much. White moves queen d1 to d3, attacking the bishop. Pawn to d4. And now, what sort of sequence of moves would you consider is best for white here? I played queen a6 check, king d7, queen a4 check. A difficult move to meet. If black plays king e7, white pins the queen. So black went king back to c8, white played bishop b7 check, king b8, and now rook to b5, and black's game is absolutely hopeless. Well, that's not a definitive game. It shows the line is viable. White hopes. Now let's return to diagram 5, where white has played bishop f4, black goes g7 to g5, white bishop to c1, and Hebden didn't play g5, g4, he played bishop to c5. Now white plays his knight from b1 to d2, and black has many choices here. One interesting one is for him to play g5 to g4 at this point. I think in that case, white could play knight d2 takes e4, and if black played d5 takes e4, white can go knight to g5, black knight takes e5, white knight takes e4, back bishop to c7, and white could now probably play bishop h6 with good play. Now return now to diagram 8. And after white's knight b1 to d2, Hebden chose to play knight e4 takes on d2. White played bishop c1 takes on d2. Now black again has interesting choice. He could play h7 h6, to which I think b2 b4 is an interesting answer by white. Instead black played g5 to g4. Now, however, white's play is even more pronounced. He played energetically bishop d2 to g5. And black moved his queen, so moved his bishop from c5 back to e7. If he moves his queen, then white could then move his knight back to d2, which the square has been vacated. So black played bishop e7, white took on e7, and black took with the queen. And white now played knight f3 takes d4. Black, of course, captured knight takes e5. And this is position of diagram 9. I'd like you to look at it and consider what you would play for white here. Now we must consider in this position what compensation white has for the pawn. I think white has a good deal. And probably the best move for white is queen d2, putting the queen on the dark squares, which are weakened by black's pawn structure and lack of black squared bishop. After queen d2, if black goes for the king side, his defensive position is chronic. White could play moves like rook e1 and f4. Also queen h6 is going to come in. Now, the other possibility for black after queen d2 is to say get his king onto the queen side. But even bishop e6, again rook e1, castles queen side, queen to a5 looks a very promising position for white. His attack is going to look very strong here. Now, in the actual game, and this is from diagram 9, I didn't choose this queen d2 move. I actually played f2 to f4, g4 takes f3, knight takes f3. Possibly bishop takes f3 was better here. I think knight takes f3 allows black to get in a check. Right, so white's played knight takes f3, and black here played knight takes f3 check. White bishop takes f3. But here black played a strong move. He played queen c5 check, king to h1, and now bishop to e6. The important thing of putting the queen on c5 check is not just to give a check, but to prevent white bringing his queen to a really dominating post at d4. Time and again we see this d4 square of pivotal importance for white, and often when he places a queen there, it radiates over the board. But here black has got in first, and the queen at c5 actually dominates the white queen rather than vice versa. Now by this time my play was beginning to fizzle, so I had to think of a few things to keep the game going. Now we'll go through the game together, and as it was full of knotty tactical problems, I'll be frequently asking you to switch off and decide your moves yourself. Now, so decide what you would play for white in this position. Here I chose to play bishop f3 to g4. It was obvious that black wanted to castle queenside, and this intended, after castles, to play rook takes f7, which would regain white's lost pawn immediately. However, even after bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop check, king b8, white queen to f5, and black probably moves the rook to f8. Probably this position is better for black, slightly. Still, Hebden didn't choose this line, so we'll put black's king back on e8 and black's rook on a8, white's rook on f1, and black's pawn on f7. Now his move was also quite a surprise to me. It went h7 to h5, And now, of course, if I take on h5, he would castle queenside, and then the white king would come under tremendous attack from the black pieces. So rather than open up that file, I reluctantly had to play bishop takes e6, f7 takes e6, and now queen d1 to e2. Once again, black had the opportunity to give his pawn back and maybe at least get equality, but certainly no less. But playing an old has-been, Hebden was no doubt aiming to get the full point, so he played rather riskily rook h8 to h6, foregoing castling for the moment but guarding his e-pawn. Now this gave white the opportunity to whip up an attack before black got his king into safety. So white's move was the sharp b2 to b4, and if black now took the pawn with queen takes b4, white would move his rook from a1 to b1 and then probably capture the black pawn at b7, which would enable black to castle on neither side, because both positions for the king would be shattered. So black's choice after b4 was not to take the pawn, but put his queen back onto b6. And the idea is to still hit the e3 square, which the white queen was aiming to get at. Now, what would you play for white here? White here choose the move c2 to c4. He must act fiercely, because otherwise black's just going to castle queenside and have an extra pawn. So c2 to c4, and black now played his move, castles queenside. It is possible that he could have taken the pawn on c4, but then white could possibly play queen d2 or rook d1. One of those moves, and trap the black king in the center. So black got his king into safety with castles queenside, but now the white pawns are starting to look threatening, and lines might get opened on the queen side against the black king. Now white played c4 to c5, and black played queen from b6 to c6. So turn off your tapes here and decide what you would play for white here. Well, there are lots of choices for white in this position. Maybe rook f1 to c1, or the other rook to c1, or maybe a2, a4. And I'm not actually sure which one is best anyway. And it would take some time to analyze them all out. I actually chose b4 to b5. Black's move was queen c6 takes c5, and white played rook a1 to c1. Here, if black brings his queen back to b6, white has the possibility of bringing his rook to f7, and then his queen to e5 with pressure against the black position. So after white played rook a1 to c1, black played his queen back to e7, and white played queen from e2 to e3, forking the rook at h6 and the pawn at a7. Black now played rook to f6 here, and white took on a7. Queen takes a7 with some threats. Black played rook d8 to f8. White played rook to g1 to avoid the exchange of rooks, and black played queen to d6. Now at this point black has probably emerged from his difficulties, so it looks like white misplayed the attack. At the time I thought that I was just finishing Hebden off, but my move that I chose, b6, was completely wrong. After b5 to b6, unfortunately black could just simply ignore the attack and play his pawn from c7 to c6. And now after queen to a8 check, black will just play queen back to b8, and the attack is dead. Well, there wasn't much to be done after the c6 move. White did check at a8, black played queen b8, and now white attempted in vain to recycle his pieces into better positions. The real problem with this position is that white cannot play rook takes c6 check, pawn takes c6, queen takes c6 check. Black would just play king to d8. This was the point of black's move from rooking rook from d8 to f8. So here white attempted to get back in the game. He played queen a3, black went king d7, queen c3, h4, a4, black queen to f4, black starting to dominate the position, a5, h3, a6. Black played h takes g check, and white played rook takes g2. I wonder what you would choose for black in this position. Hedren played a very nice move, queen from f4 to e4. That has the immediate threat of rook to f1 check and catastrophe, so white moved his king from h1 to g1. Okay, now what would you now choose for black here? Black now moved his rook from f6 to g6. White moved rook g2 to g3. And black played rook f8 to f3. So all the time white's been hoping to capture something on b7 and then capture on c6, but he's just too late to do anything. White brought his queen back from c3 to e1. Black played queen takes e1, rook takes e1, and now rook from g6 took on g3 check, h takes g, and here after black's move b7 takes a6, white resigned. There's just too many pawns down, and the move b7 is easily answered by king c7, rook b1, king b8, and black will win quite easily this position. In fact, actually after b7 black could play rook takes check on g3, back to g8, and then maybe rook to b8 is more accurate. So an interesting game, not a defeat for the system, because white had many chances in the early stages and even in the later middle game. Now I'd like to turn to a different line of the knight e4 variation, and this is from diagram 5. After white plays knight takes d4, and instead of black playing knight takes e5, which we looked at earlier, we'll look at the variation black knight takes d4, white queen takes d4, black bishop c5, white queen from d4 to d3. Now this was another game of Hebden's, and it occurred about 1980 between Taylor and Hebden. Now Hebden went for active piece play here. He castled on the king side. White played knight b1 to c3, and here black moved his bishop from c8 to f5. Now there's some threats of discoveries with this knight, but nothing particularly clear at the moment. So white played knight c3 takes d5, and you see if black moves his knight, say to g3, white would just take it with the queen, or if he plays knight takes f2, white could take that bishop on f5, so it appears. Now instead of this, black played rook to king 1, rook e8. White moved bishop from c1 to f4. Black moved his bishop from f5 to g6. Here white finally did make a big mistake. He moved his rook from a1 to d1, and after knight takes f2 he was in some difficulties. Taylor subsequently suggests in his article that he should move his queen from d3 to b3, and with good winning chances because of his extra pawn, which seems a fair comment. Now let's look into his more detailed analysis of this game. Now back to diagram 5. White plays knight takes d4, black knight takes d4, white queen takes d4, black bishop c5. This way black gains 10p for development. White queen back to d3. And Taylor makes an interesting comment here that the white queen looks oddly placed, but she retains flexibility with control of the third rank. In fact, in the analysis that follows, we'll see that white queen will often switch back and forth along this third rank. Now, here's one example. Black castles, and white plays knight c3. Taylor also suggests moves like knight d2 or bishop e3, and they also seem quite sensible moves. If black after knight c3 plays knight takes knight, white plays queen takes knight, and the queen's being useful here on c3, attacking that bishop on c5. Now let's return to diagram 10, and instead of black castling actually in this position, we'll play for black the move bishop to f5. This aims to make some discoveries against the white queen. Now, after bishop to f5, white isn't really threatened by any particular discoveries. He could go off on a little jaunt with his queen by queen to b5 check, but this looks rather too time wasting. Black can play c6, and after white takes the pawn, just castle. And black's got a very good attack here. Now, instead of the queen check, white could play knight d2, or he could play knight to c3. But the move that Taylor suggests is the immediate bishop to e3. And the aim of this is to exchange off black's strong dark squared bishop and leaving black with a less powerful bishop at f5, which is hampered by its own pawn at d5. Now, after bishop to e3, black has got interesting sorts of moves. He is invited, of course, to move his knight from e4 to g3. But then, at this point, white's queen check does come in useful. He can play queen to b5 check. Black plays c7, c6. White plays queen, takes bishop on c5, and black now takes the bishop on e2 with check. White goes king to h1. And according to Taylor, the knight at e2 will find difficulty in extricating itself from this position. Another possibility for black after they move from diagram 10, after the move black bishop f5, white bishop to e3, is for black to move his pawn from d5 down to d4. At this point, white will calmly move his bishop from e3 to f4. And after black castles, white moves his queen. He switches his queen, as we've noted. This is one of the themes. Queen from d3 to f3. Now, the threat here is white going bishop to d3, dislodging that knight at e4. Black thrusts forward with pawn to f6, trying to open up the file against the white queen, but white then plays bishop c4 check, king to h8, and now e5 to e6. And this looks a promising position for white. He can complete his development and get rooks on the e-file. Now let's return again to diagram 10. Black plays his bishop to f5 and white plays bishop to e3. Now here black has a choice possibly of moving his bishop back to b6, and then the suggestion is to play the queen from d3 over to a3. This is to prevent black castling. Now if black takes the bishop at e3, white switches back, recaptures with his queen, and there's a transposition into other variations. Bishop takes bishop, therefore. White queen takes bishop at e3, black castles. Now let's see this suggestion, interesting suggestion by Taylor. g2 to g4, bishop moves back to g6, and now f2 to f3, and black seems to be getting rolled up in the center. Now if he moves his knight to g5, white will play pawn to f4 followed by pawn to f5. So after f2 to f3, black plays d5 down to d4, and white has to move his queen away now. Let's see where it could go. Well, maybe it has to go back, it has to go to f4, but now black can escape with knight to c5. So, well, I'm not so sure if white did come out well from this situation. He seems to have disrupted his position a bit and not really gained that much in exchange. However, let's look at this line another time. After black plays this d4 move, instead of queen f4, white could play his queen over to a3, and this prevents the black knight from getting back to c5. Now if we look at the position, there aren't really any retreats for this knight now. We've just taken the last one away. I could go to g5, that's the only other possibility. Then white could play pawn to f4, and if knight e6, white can play pawn to f5, forking the two pieces. So white's starting to roll his pawns up against the exposed and of course developed black pieces. Now the only move I can see for black to cause complications would be to play his pawn from d4 to d3 after white plays pawn to f4, hitting the knight. White could probably then capture c2 takes d3, black queen d4 check, king g2, queen e3, knight c3, queen h3 check, king h1, and the black pieces are still in the toils. Now that ends the analysis, and now we'll come to the summary of variations. Now, if you remember, white puts his bishop on e2 on move 3, and this prepares castling, doesn't yet commit the c-pawn, so white has knight c3 as a possibility, and also white intends to advance with pawn to d4 to get greater central control. Now, after this move, black's main defense is to play knight f6, attacking the e-pawn straight away, and white moves his pawn up to d4. If black then defends with pawn to d6, white could play knight c3. So instead of black pawn to d6, black would play pawn takes on d4. White then pushes on pawn to e5. And here one of the advantages of the system comes out of having the bishop on e2, because black doesn't have the counter thrust pawn to d5, which he would have if white's bishop was on c4. So black just has to move his knight. At some point he's got to move his knight to d5, which I think is the weakest move. g4 is possible, after which white castles and sacrifices his pawn at e5. And the other move is knight to e4, and then black follows up with d5. And this was the line which we spent some time on. After knight e4, white castles, and black plays pawn to d5. And then the parting of the ways for white is whether he plays bishop f4 here, as in Basman Hebden, or he plays knight takes d4. And knight takes d4 leads into a variation after black plays knight takes e5. As I said, I wasn't convinced with Taylor's variation, which was f3, black moving his knight back to d6, and then f4. I thought black could play knight c6 and exchange the knights, and they then play pawn to c6, which seemed to give him a solid position. So I looked around for another line, and possibly the move bishop b5 check instead of pawn to f3, and then black plays pawn c6, bishop f4, black bishop to d6, and there's a possible sacrifice here, knight takes c6, which leads to unearthly complications. Now, the final line is when black doesn't try to take the pawn after white has played knight takes d4, and black just exchanges knights and plays bishop c5, and this was what we're looking at. This was another Hebden game. Now I'd like to look at a couple of, well, 2 or 3 of the inferior replies which black can choose. Now the first one, if you have your pieces in the start position, is where white goes e4, black e5, white knight f3, black knight c6, white bishop e2. Now here black could play bishop c5. Many players will think, you know, this is the right move. Aren't we playing a sort of Gyoko piano, and white has played rather passively. Here white could either play pawn c3, and it would be probably a somewhat superior Gyoko piano, because after pawn c3, if black played knight f6, white could play pawn d4, and then if black played pawn takes d4, well, white wouldn't need to capture at d4 yet, which would allow the bishop b4 check move, followed by black capturing on e4. So, as I say, white doesn't capture on d4. He can play pawn to e5. And once again, white's bishop at e2 is well placed, because this move, pawn to e5, would normally be met by black hitting back with pawn to d5. So after pawn to e5, black, say, moves his knight somewhere like g4, and then white can play pawn takes d4, and this hits the bishop and guards his e5 pawn. So white will probably get the better center position. Now if you put your pieces back a bit to the position of diagram 1 and play again black's bishop to c5, which, as I said, is not the best move. It exposes the bishop. White can play knight takes e5 here instead of pawn c3. Now black could play here bishop takes f2 check. That's an interesting possibility. Bishop takes f2 check. Then white would play king takes f2, and black would play knight takes e5. White could now go rook to f1. I think this may be the best. But d4 I think is also possible. Might even be better, d4. Yeah, maybe we play d4. Then if queen h5 check, just pawn to g3. Queen h4 check, pawn to g3, yeah. So d4, knight goes to c6, and now rook f1, queen h4 check, king to g1, queen takes e4. And here white must justify his loss of a pawn. Not sure I could do that against a computer. Maybe actually instead of rook to f1 we play rook e1, and then after queen h4 check, king g1, black won't be able to take the pawn at e4 because white can play bishop f3, winning the black queen. Now let's return to diagram 1, and after black plays bishop c5, white knight takes e5. We've looked at bishop takes f2 check. The advantages white would gain would be from that the better pawn center plus the knight for the bishop. We're assuming the knight is worth slightly less than the bishop in positional chess. And this whole fork trick is based on gaining these two positional advantages, superiority in the center and the two bishops in an open position. So positional chess actually comes into this opening as well as tactical chess. Now after knight takes e5, black knight takes e5 is another move. White could then play pawn to d4,
After bishop takes d4, white plays queen takes d4, black pawn to d6, and this should be an easy game for white to play. He can develop easily, he has a better center, and he has two bishops. Well, we'll look at another possible positionally inferior move black could choose, and this is from diagram 1. He can play d7 to d5. I find computers like to play this move. They will tend to emphasize bringing pieces into the center, even though they expose them. So white plays pawn takes d5, black plays queen takes d5, white knight c3. And black's best here, I think, is queen c5. He could play also queen a5. Queen c5 stops white from playing d2, d4. And actually, in the magazine article, which I wrote for Pop Chess, which is enclosed in the materials for this tape, you'll find various suggestions on how white should play this line. Now, there's a third line, the third inferior line, and this is from diagram 1. Black plays knight f6, white d4, and black plays knight takes e4. And here there's a fascinating variation where white goes d5, black knight e7, could go back to b8, white knight takes e5. Now this position should be slightly better for white. After d7 to d6, white could possibly put his knight back onto f3, and that pawn at d5 does cramp black's position. Now there is also a tactical continuation, which I'm not sure if it works, but it's certainly interesting. White can play bishop b5 check. This doesn't work if black has his knight on b8, because in that case black could play knight b8 to d7. So now here, though, black has to play pawn c6, white plays pawn takes c6, and black goes, well, if he captures at c6, white would then capture with the knight, and then black's position would collapse. So black plays the move queen to b6, threatening mate at f2. Now white has several moves here, but one of the most interesting is to play pawn takes b7 discovered check. And here if black takes the pawn, black takes the bishop at b5, white can just take the rook at a8 and be lots of pieces up. So black plays king d8, and white plays knight e5 takes f7 check. Black plays king c7. Now, how would you play for white here? Switch off and decide. Well, you could take lots of pieces. You play knight takes rook or pawn takes rook. But don't forget black's threatening a mate on f2. Well, you have several winning moves, but the best is pawn takes rook equals knight check, and that forks the black king and queen. Now, this variation is so pretty you might wish to try and get it in if your opponent plays this line, but it's not that clear. If we go back to diagram 11, after white has played pawn takes c6, we see that black can play queen to a5 check. Now this move isn't possible in the similar variation that white can get in what is called the Ponziani opening, because white's pawn would be at c3 there. Now after queen a5 check, white has to play, I believe, knight c3, and black plays knight d4, e4 takes c3, and again maybe you'd like to switch off and try and analyze this position. Well, in the Pop Chess article I said that black could play knight takes b5 here and white could go bishop d2, winning. But actually a reader, Mr. Culpen, suggested that instead of knight takes b5, black could play queen takes b5, white pawn takes rook equals queen, black queen e5 check, white bishop to e3, black knight takes d1, white rook takes d1. Now black queen takes b2, and now if white castles, black could play queen to b7, and the position is not at all clear.